Hey, good evening. Hold on. Not all plugged in yet, but I'm glad if you are already here. Boom. There. All right. Testing 1, 2. If you can hear me, raise your hand. So, sorry, I didn't have my mics all plugged in. I had everything undone. So, good evening, folks. Welcome. It is now Monday evening. Yeah, that's right, Monday. And it's, if it's relevant, it's June 17th, 2019, for everybody that's here and doesn't know the date. I haven't been back for a couple of days over the weekend, doing a show with Rocky tonight. So if you're going to be around right after this show at 11 p.m. Central Standard Time, midnight East Coast time, Rocky and I will be on the Situation Room. And you know what I just did? I've had a sore throat the last few days and a little bit of a dry cough that went with it. Now it's it's doing its thing. And so I made some tea, which is, I don't drink tea quite as often as I drink coffee. I thought because it's late, I'll have tea. And I put honey into it. Should have put lemon in, but honey is good for your throat, especially raw honey. So I put honey into it, and I just sat down here and I ran my fingers through my hair and realized I had honey all over my hand. So I'm still trying to get that off of my fingers while plugging in my mic. And my new hair gel, raw honey. So there you go. Good to see you here, folks. It's not Manuka. I would like to have Manuka. So it's local honey made by local people here in town. And let's see. What do we got? COPD. No, I don't have COPD. Thank you very much. Both my son and I have this same thing going on, my little boy. And we got runny noses. We got the cough, the dry cough. And then it's gone into the chesty cough. And then hopefully it'll be gone within a few days. My doc told me, I get these all the time. Chest stuff. Since I was a kid, I've had pneumonia. I've had walking pneumonia. I've had all kinds of junk. So that's what he said it was. Let's see. COPD, yes, can hear. Okay, I don't know what the COPD is then, if that's not what you're talking about. Let's see. Who all's here? So Suze, you're here. Good to see you. Becky, good to see you. And let's see. What else we got going on? Let's see. Michelle, good to see you. And TT, good to see you. James Sheets, good to see you, brother. And let's see. That's I think everybody who's here so far. Holly, good to see you as well. And I don't know you as well as some of the others, but I'm glad you're here. I've seen you several times. Mark, Sinner Saint, good to see you. Glad you're here. I know Jeffrey's going to be on live here too. And so he... I don't know. We're not competing with each other. We just end up getting on at the same time. So I am generally going to be 9 o'clock every weeknight. And so you can catch me here at that time. And if you don't catch me, if you're trading, bouncing between Jeff and I, we both have archives. You can catch my show in archives anytime. Let's see. Becky, your ex-husband is in a hospital. Well, I'm sorry to hear that. I hope everything goes well for him. Sorry to hear that. And Joyce, good to see you. I don't know if I said hi to you earlier, unless you just slipped in here. So it's good to see you here too. Tonight, I'm going to continue this little series that I am doing on King David. It's kind of a study on King David. And the reason I'm doing this is because I've gotten to that place where I question a lot of things about my former faith. And I say former faith because if I believe any sliver of what that faith used to be, it's not the same as it used to be. We were in a very, if you remember, many times I've said, in a very conservative Baptist fundamentalist setting as I was growing up. You didn't question a lot. If you asked questions, it was to learn questions about what you were being taught. It was not to question what you were being taught. And so there was quite the indoctrination process, although they would not have seen themselves as being people who were trying to indoctrinate you. They saw themselves as teaching the truth, and this is what they believed. And it's not like they were phonies behind the scene that said, let's teach them all this crap and tell them it's the truth when we know it's really not. That's not it at all. These people all believed what they believed. And when I taught it, when I was in ministry, in those circles, I believed it just as well. But as you know, and Jeff and I don't know if you know much about Jeff's and my background. We really got to know each other when Rocky and John Ward and I were doing radio way back. Well, it's not way back. It was in the last decade, 6 to 8 years ago. And Jeff was kind of on the fringes of things that I was beginning to recognize and see people. I don't remember how he and I first met, to tell you the God honest truth. Other than I either reached out to him or he reached out to me. We got to talking. He was just thinking of writing his book, Apostle Paul Antichrist. And he ended up having me do the cover design for him. And that's how we kind of got to know each other. And then we had a radio network going, Rocky Stucci and John Ward and I, the IPBN network, and which became Streaming Talk Radio, and then Rocky, of course, went on to some other things. And so Jeff was one of the shows that we had a few years ago, started broadcasting on our network, along with Sarah Soderlin, if you remember her from Rocky's show the other night, and a few other people that you're familiar with. And so I can see Jeff may have started his show because the number has dropped down to about half of what it was when we first started. So that's okay. You can come back and check this out a little later. And so now Jeff does his thing. This is his whole life right now. For me, it's part of my life, what I do. And so sometimes our time slots will conflict. That's okay. You can come back and hear either one of us in archives. So I want to thank you all for being here. Now, as I started to say, this story of David intrigues me because I was I'm tending my tea over here. That's why I'm looking over to my right. I've got my cup of tea here, and I'm trying to get that ready to drink. The reason this story of David intrigues me, and this book that I found and read a couple of years ago intrigues me, is because it really digs into the story and says all those things that you had questions about, all those things that you wondered about, the inconsistencies that exist in Scripture and things like that, there really is an answer for that. And that answer is that there were so many things that were apologetics, as we mentioned last time we talked about David. And tonight, I want to talk a bit about David's youth and the things that he experienced, the stories as we know them, and the two big things that we know about David. One, we know that he was called the sweet psalmist of Israel. He was the writer of the book of Psalms. Not every one of them, but most of them, we know are attributed to David. And the other thing was David, the valiant warrior, the giant slayer is how his story really starts out. And so we know those two things about David. And the problem with those two things is that they tend to conflict with each other as origin stories for David. And that makes it very hard to sometimes decipher where the Bible is taking you in the story. And the overall thrust that I have in relaying this information to you is that I think the biblical story needs to be looked at. Now, why do we do this? Why do we look at the Bible story? Why do we question it? It's because of things that I've talked about with Rocky, that I've talked about with Jeff. This idea that sometimes what we said we believed in those circles was filled with stuff that sounds very much like what we heard from other circles. Let's see. Audrey says, hey, Big Cannoli, leaving the office. I'll jump back in as soon as I can get there. Go buy Scotty stuff. Thank you. And there's the links for my stuff, my websites, and Streaming Talk Radio, where you can find all my stuff. Thank you, Audrey. We'll see you when you get back here. And so what I have a problem with is these stories being used to really, in a sense, in a positive way, you could say, indoctrinate us into the faith. Yet those stories have holes in them. They have problems with them, historical problems, theological problems. As we mentioned in the last session about King David, is that our first inclinations when we think about David, if you learn anything about him at all, I'm talking church, Sunday school, synagogue, any of that. If you learned about David, you knew he was the psalmist, you knew he was the guy who slew Goliath. Those are the two basic things most people know about him. But that he was a good man, he was this good man we were to emulate, and that the line of the Messiah, Jesus Christ, could be traced back through his mother, Mary, and also through his stepfather, Joseph. They both had ties to King David. And how King David, after his time, which was in the 9th century and 10th century, 900s BCE, that David was really had become at that time the Messiah, the kinsman redeemer, the one who would be one of us redeemer, the Christ in the Greek, had to come from the line of David, who was the rightful king of Israel. And so this apologetic about David began, I think, even during his life, shortly after his death, that those who were writing down his story, you will find accounts of the things that David did, but then you will also find that they have been, if you will, doctored up, even in antiquity, that what they wanted you to know about David was that he was a righteous man after God's own heart. Pardon me. This is the nasty cough I have going on right now. So what the apologetic does is attempt to whitewash that, to paint him in a much better light than he was. And TT, you're asking me that is true, Scotty? You're asking me a question there. Maybe I've got to go back a little bit. Tons of holes, says Joyce, except when understood as celestial. Maybe so. Let's see. Yeah, so what I find is being true, TT, if this is what you were asking me, is that the story of David, I don't think there's any reason to not believe he wasn't a real guy, that he really was a king of Israel, that he really was a unifier of the clans in his territory. It was like, remember, he comes from Judea, the hill country, which was filled with the different clans of Israel. Yes, TT, we can. I don't know that we can track the lineage of Jesus per se, but the New Testament does that for us. The New Testament followers of Jesus said in the Gospels that Mary comes from the line of David, and that even Joseph, the stepfather, her husband, came from the line of David. Now, can we say there's a genealogical record in place? No, we really can't. But what we do know is that the gospel writers insisted that Mary was from the line of David, which was supposed to be a prerequisite after the time of David for the coming Messiah. And so they assert that she is from David. They ameliorated his deeds. Indeed, James, I think they did. And I think his deeds, you will find through this little series we're doing. I don't want to let any cats out of the bag or any surprises, but you'll find that there were things like even the slaying of Goliath, which is the whole David and Goliath story. It's been known for millennia, this story. Yet the way it is worded, there is another passage in Scripture that actually attributes that deed to someone else. And it's part of the same Old Testament. And so there are stories there that we have to look at. And tonight we're going to cover a little bit of David's early life. And we're going to show how there are two biblical introductions for David into the story of David. And they seem to contradict each other. And so this is a big question that we have to ask, is who was he then? Goliath was a Nephilim, the scripture says. Goliath, one of the remnant of the Nephilim, or the sons of the Nephilim. And that Goliath had three brothers who were also sons of the Nephilim. It says, and we'll hit this tonight a little bit, that Goliath was 6 cubits and a span tall. Cubit was basically here to here. So you do the math of that. 6 of those and a span, which is this, from knuckle to knuckle on your hand. So 6 cubits and a span, depending on how long your arm is, could be 9 foot to 10 foot, right in that range. There are some who say that the Septuagint, which is the Greek version of the Old Testament, which is what shows up in our Bibles, only says in certain places 4 cubits in a span, which would bring him down to about 6.5 to 7 foot tall, which makes him just a big guy for his day. Because people weren't that tall in that day. And so yes, there is some controversy over that. So very often in the Bible, a character's birth story kind of gives him, identifies him or her, and lends them their significance in the biblical tale. Isaac was this miraculous child of Abraham and Sarah's old age. You remember that? And you remember Isaac, I think the name means she laughed. And remember the story? The angels came and visited Abraham and said, who is 100 years old or 101? His wife was 99, something like that. And they said she's going to have a baby. And she's behind the drape of the tent listening, and she laughed under her breath. Right? I'm going to have a baby. And so they said, you'll name the kid Isaac, because she just laughed. So that's what the name means. So Isaac, who fathered Jacob, who was also known as Israel, who was the father of the 12 tribes of Israel. Samson's birth. Remember that? It's announced to his mother by an angel, because Samson would be the one that would defeat the Philistines. Samuel, the great prophet and the judge. He's the one whose book, by the way, encompasses a lot of the story of David. He's born in accordance with Hannah's faithful prayer. And Jesus is marked, even from before his birth, as conceived by the Holy Spirit, destined to redeem Israel from its sins. And so, given the litany of biblical heroes that have these birth stories and these birth narratives, it's somewhat surprising that David's birth, indeed his entire childhood as a kid, we know absolutely nothing about. And the Bible gives only the barest facts. Where was David born? He was born in Bethlehem. Yes, that same Bethlehem, not Bethlehem, Pennsylvania, Bethlehem, Israel. About 6-7 miles out in the outskirts from Jerusalem, in the hill country. His father's name was Jesse. We know that much. He has 7 older brothers, and only the first 3 of whom are named. And the family's profession is shepherding. They had sheep. And in David, he's really a nobody from a nowhere place. He's the youngest son of a man with no claim to wealth or fame. He's merely just a shepherd. And that's what the biblical story and the writers wanted us to know. His conception and birth are unnoticed by any divine being, and even by the Bible itself. It was deemed unimportant to the story. And at the same time, everybody loves an underdog, and so he's an underdog. He fits the bill. He's someone with a background where, like David's, could eventually become the greatest king of Israel. Then it would seem there's hope for us all. That's kind of the hope that's built into this story of David, as you see it spelled out in the scripture. And the Bible relates those 2 stories I was telling you about, of how teenage David rose from his humble origins to prominence in King Saul, who was the first king of Israel, King Saul's court. And he was Saul's lyre player. He was his harpist, guitarist, if you would, a stringed instrument. And he was also known as the Slayer of Goliath. And these stories are from the passages 1 Samuel 16 and 17. And respectively, the most famous episodes of David's life are these two events. And the rest is fluff on the cake, frosting on the cake. So the first image of David to appear in the Bible is David as musician. If you remember, in his youth, he's brought to Saul's court. Now, Saul was the first king of Israel. Saul was chosen because the Bible says he stood head and shoulders over every other man. He was a standout in the crowd. He was a good-looking dude. He was a big man, and he had what it took, and so he was brought in as king, anointed as king. And he has sons. He has his son Jonathan, who would be the next king in his place. And remember, God said through the prophet Samuel at the time, when Saul was right, God said through the prophet, "You don't want a king. If you have a king, that's gonna unify you all. He's gonna tax you. He's gonna lay heavy burdens on you. He's gonna increase horses and chariots to himself, build rich palaces, and do all these things." People said, "Give us a king anyway." So Samuel anointed him. And this is a story. It's got the longest afterlife because Saul had a very troubled mind later in his life. And I believe that this scene with David is the stuff that starts to take place after God had said, "I'm going to rip the kingdom from your hands." Let's see, I saw something here. Yeah, Jeff's show started. Yeah, that's why we're down to just a handful of listeners. Let's see. What's not trustful, referring to the Bible, Goliath with us and Nephilim. Yep, we saw that. Okay. And so as we go on here, this story, Saul disobeys God. God tells him to go into a town that he conquered to wipe them all out. Every man, woman, child, every goat, everything. And Saul doesn't do it. And he does it a different way. And so the prophet Samuel comes and says, "God has rent the kingdom from your hands." And he pulls this all out of Saul's hands. And he says, "Another will be anointed in your place." And the kingdom would be ripped from the house of Saul. So not just Saul himself was going to lose the kingdom, but his family, his son, will never become king. And it said, this is something that gave Saul a very troubled mind. So as the story goes, David's youthful skill with the lyre is immediately connected to, in popular imagination, with his lifelong status as the author of the Psalms, because Saul brings him in. He's recommended. There's this certain kid that's the son of Jesse, a shepherd in your kingdom who can play well. So he brings him in and has him play for Saul, and it calms his mind. And David's the quintessential lyricist. He writes the Psalms, he writes songs, and is perhaps just as famous for the songs he wrote as for anything else he might have done in the biblical stories. After his death, David's authorship of the Psalms quickly became the defining act of his life. Not slaying Goliath, but writing these Psalms that he left behind. So David's connection to the Psalms was recognized. It was valued already in ancient times. 3,000 years ago, David was recognized for what he wrote. Israel recognizes him. And at the end of his life, he records a song to the Lord, recorded in 2 Samuel 22. And the song is none other than what we know as Psalm 18. Here, I'm going to read that to you. Psalm 18 goes like this, and I've got an Old English Bible. The King James is all I've got sitting here on my desk. So this was my old Bible I showed you the other night. Psalm 19 is what I'm looking for. 18. Hang on. So this is a psalm that David wrote. And It's one that a song that he wrote to the Lord. And this is what he's known for. If I can get through these very thin onion skin type pages. Psalm 18 says, I'm not going to read the whole thing because it's long. It's 50 verses long. But this is to the chief musician, a psalm of David, the servant of the Lord, who spoke unto the Lord the words of this song in the day that the Lord delivered him from the hand of all his enemies and from the hand of Saul. And he said, David said, I will love thee, O Lord, my strength. The Lord is my rock and my fortress and my deliverer, my God, my strength in whom I will trust, my buckler and the horn of my salvation and my high tower. I will call upon the Lord, who is worthy to be praised. So shall I be saved from mine enemies. The sorrow of death compassed me, and the floods of... I got to tell you, I got to put on my cheaters. Hold on. Sorry about that, folks. You'd think I could read without them, but I can't. I've been staring at my computer screen all day working on stuff, so my eyes are kind of fuzzy. He says, the sorrows of death compassed me, and the floods of ungodly men made me afraid. The sorrows of hell compassed me about. The snares of death prevented me. In my distress I called upon the Lord, and I cried out unto my God. He heard my voice out of his temple, and my cry came before him, even unto his ears. And then the earth shook and trembled. The foundations also of the hills moved and were shaken because he was wroth. And there went up smoke out of his nostrils and fire out of his mouth, devoured. Coals were kindled by it. He bowed the heavens also and came down, and darkness was under his feet. And he rode upon a cherub and did fly. Yea, he did fly upon the wings of the wind. He made darkness his secret place. His pavilion round about him were dark waters and thick clouds of the skies. At the brightness that was before him, his thick clouds passed hailstones and coals of fire. The Lord also thundered in the heavens, and the highest gave his voice hailstones and coals of fire. Yea, he sent out his arrows and scattered them, and he shot out lightnings and discomfited them. Then the channels, I wasn't going to read the whole thing, but this is kind of interesting. We'll see how far this goes. Then the channels of waters were seen, and the foundations of the world were discovered at thy rebuke, O Lord, at the blast of the breath of thy nostrils. He sent from above. He took me, he drew me out of many waters. He delivered me from my strong enemy, and from them which hated me, for they were too strong for me. They prevented me in the day of my calamity, but the Lord was my stay. He brought me forth also into a large place. He delivered me because he delighted in me. The Lord rewarded me according to my righteousness. According to the cleanliness of my hands, he hath recompensed me. For I have kept the ways of the Lord, and have not wickedly departed from my God. For all his judgments were before me, and I did not put away his statutes from me. I was also upright before him, and I kept myself from mine iniquity. Therefore hath the Lord recompensed me according to my righteousness, according to the cleanliness of my hands in his eyesight. And it goes on and on. He talks about the mercy of God. And it ends, therefore will I give thanks unto thee, O Lord, among the heathen, and sing praises unto thy name. Great deliverance giveth he to his kings, and shows mercy to his anointed, to David, and to his seed forevermore. So this was the psalm that David had written, and that appears in 2 Samuel 22. And David was the first to really institute this whole rite of singing of songs to the Lord in the temple. And even though there wasn't a temple at the time of David, there was I got a hair hanging in my face. Sorry, folks. There was a tabernacle. They still had the tabernacle of the covenant. It was Solomon, his son, who built the temple. But it was his songs he established that in the tabernacle, and then in the temple they carried on that practice. And so You look at this, and even before the turn of the Common Era, the time of Christ, the Psalms have become so thoroughly associated with David that they could be referred to simply by his name. In the Dead Sea Scrolls, we find references to the book of Moses and the books of the prophets and David. And some is true of the New Testament, only in Acts. And the books of Moses, as we know, Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy, the books of the law. That's the books of Moses. And so David became, you could go to David and read the Psalms. And the words of the Psalter are introduced with reference to David. For David himself says in the book of Psalms, Luke 20:42 says, or far more frequently, David said, or David declared, or David did this, David did that, sang this, sang that, wrote this for the conductor, and so on. And he's become synonymous with the book of Psalms, just like Moses was synonymous with the book of the law. So the equating of a biblical character with a distinct biblical corpus does more than simply attribute authorship. It defines the fundamental character trait of that figure, which is what we found about David. That David, he's known as the sweet psalmist of Israel. He wrote these songs. He was a poet. He was a songwriter. He was a musician. And this lives after him. The tradition goes back 3,000 years. Moses, by being identified with the Torah, the first 5 books of the Bible, becomes the archetypical lawgiver, for better or for worse, depending on one's religious background. I'm sorry, I still got like a weird hair that's hanging in my face and bugging me while I'm trying to talk and breathe. And David's connection with the book of Psalms really positions him as the ultimate model of faith and worship. And this is who he became. Now, remember, we're talking about a biblical character who was a real life character that I believe was invented to become better than he was. So there's going to be some questions about the anatomy of the Psalms and of what he did and what he wrote. For thousands of years, the words of the Psalms have been at hand for expressing just about anything that you'd want to. There was a quote I had written here. I think this is John Calvin said, "I've been accustomed to call this book, the book of Psalms, I think not inappropriately, an anatomy of all the parts of the soul. For there's not an emotion of which anyone can be conscious that is not here represented as a mirror. For thousands of years, the words of the Psalms have been at hand for expressing one's deepest feelings, just as they were for Jesus when he said on the cross, 'My God, why hast thou forsaken me? Into your hands I commend my spirit.'" The last spoken words of Christ in Mark 15 and Luke 23. They found first in the Psalms, in Psalm 22 and in Psalm 31. Members of many contemporary religious groups, from Christians to Hasidic Jews, read the Psalms daily as a devotional act. And they've been enshrined in liturgy in every branch of Christianity and Judaism, stretching back even into the biblical period. So it goes way back. So David, as the author of the Psalms, is this poetic, musical genius who gave poetic expression to Judeo-Christian belief. And whatever deeds he may have done, his innermost nature is exhibited in the Psalms that he wrote. The songs of praise, the thanksgivings, the laments. The Psalter stands as clear testimony to his faithfulness. So there's all these things that he did that come down to who he was. Hi.
Hi. We're watching you out there, and I thought I would come and see.
Oh, you're watching?
See the hair that you.
Here, come around here. Come around here. Here's my wife. Since Rocky's wife, as you all know, delivered him coffee last night. Here's my wife coming to deliver whatever she has to give.
Came to get the hair off your face, but I don't see it.
Yeah, I think I got it at some point.
Okay.
All right.
I'm watching you, Daddy.
I'm watching you. Always watching you. Wazowski, always watching.
She's watching you on Mom's computer.
Oh, all right. All right.
Have fun.
I will. Nice to see you.
Nice to see you.
Came in to check the hair on my face. All right. Let's see. Goliath, don't forget to like this broadcast excellence. I agree with you, Michelle. Thank you. So there was my wife, Rainey. Let's get back into where I was. This whole thing about David being established as the sweet musician, the sweet psalmist, the one who could express just about every feeling of every emotion and write it down in the book of Psalms. This is the guy that the biblical writers wanted you to know. This is David. David the king. David in his early years. David later in life is known for the Psalms. After his death, his Psalms are instituted in the temple worship. So this is who he was. His music really just defined him. And in the narrative of the Bible, he is worthy of the king's attention. Because he was brought to Saul's attention. Saul would go into fits of madness, and they would call David in to soothe the savage beast. So now, the second episode of David's youth, now that we've gotten through the music part, the second thing I said about David that defines who he is the whole story of David and Goliath. The whole David and Goliath story, if you remember what that's from. I probably didn't do it well enough for you. Caddyshack, you remember that? It's when David fights the Philistine giant. And it's a quite different narrative about who this guy is. The David who plays the musical instrument, the lyre, guitar, whatever you want to call it, is a young man at peace. And the David who faces Goliath is a young man very much at war. David the musician is sedentary. He's watching the flocks, taking care of dad's sheep back home. And he's sedentary and quiet and musical in the courts of King Saul. David the warrior, by contrast, full of motion. He's got this static face-off between the two armies. The Israelites, the Philistines, they're all dug in on either side of the ravine. And Goliath is stepping out day after day to challenge Israel to face him in a single combat. No one moves. Everybody's stuck still. And it's David that journeys from his home, arrives into this repeating set, and speaks with Saul, the king, rejects the heavy armor that Saul offers him because he said it prevents him to move freely. And he runs toward the encounter with Goliath. He runs to it. He is courage. He is nobility. And he's all those things embodied. And though only a youth, he proves himself to be the biggest man on the battlefield. Now, is it inconsistent to say that a guy who was a musician could have this kind of courage against a single combatant? Now, if you remember the story, and I told this recently in reading one of my books, you can go to the Valley of Elah today and see where this took place. It's not a big tourist site. It's just a valley in Israel. Very low valley. Low hills on either side, surrounded by hills. And this little valley is where this battle was supposed to have taken place. And it said the Philistines were all encamped on one side on the hills. Israel was up on the top of the hills on this side, and shallow hills, not very deep. And it said that Goliath would start shouting across the valley from the other side. It said in the scripture, it says he would come down taunting Israel. So he'd yell while coming down the slope, yelling at Israel, saying, send a guy out to fight me, and whoever wins will win the day. This went on for 40 days, and Israel's immobilized. Nobody would do it. Now, you think after 40 days, somebody's going to make a move. Nobody did. This is ancient times. What else did they have to do? So, finally, as you're getting toward the end of this confrontation, prior to David coming on the scene, it says, and Goliath came up toward the armies of Israel out of the valley. So what was he doing now? Every day he's getting a little closer. He started out on his side, descending into the valley. Now, by the end of the 40 days, He's coming up out of the valley onto Israel's side of the hill. This is how confident he is. And he's calling them out from the hill. And while coming up to the army. So you got Goliath now taunting Israel. David comes on the scene. David is coming from tending his father's flocks. He's the youngest. He's bringing lunch to his brothers. His dad said, bring this food to your brothers, then come back and give me a report about what's going on. And so it's all pretty close to Bethlehem there. Valley of Elah is not far from Bethlehem. So you've got this going on. Now the nobility finds expression in the most famous and beloved image of David. Remember Michelangelo's statue of David, where he's standing kind of like this in white marble. It's a glorious sculpture, but it's ironic that this story of David's bold movements is most effectively captured by the artist in a motionless figure. For as evocative as the image of the stone sinking into Goliath's forehead might be, the picture that stays with us is that of David taking his stand. He's the guy who took the stand. He's the guy who did what he needed to do, who did what nobody else would do. There is this nobility of heart. Perhaps this is a blending of the heart of the musician with the heart of the warrior. And of course, the things he says when he goes out there certainly don't sound like a shepherd boy. They sound like a poet when he talks to Goliath or answers Goliath's taunts. And so that image stays with us of David. He takes his stand. He's got a slingshot in hand with not a shred of fear in his eyes, according to the story. And we may not ever have to face down a giant in a one-to-one combat, but everyone knows the feeling of confronting that which is terrifying to us. You ever been in a terrifying situation? You ever have to go talk to your boss? You ever have to go to court and face the judge? There are so many scenarios you could bring up. But when we have intimidating, terrifying images of people that we have to deal with, this is kind of where David was. This one, of course, he could have lost his life very easily. And so David, in this possession of danger, this self-danger, this grave danger, really is supposed to be this now lasting example for us. This is undoubtedly why, despite the fact that David was at war nearly his entire life, if you look at the story of David in the Bible, he was at war nearly his whole life after this as the king of Israel. It's his first battle that lasts in the imagination. And for this is virtually the only time that David is not in a position where he holds some degree of power. He's a nobody. Only here does he stand alone against the odds. And perhaps even more significant in David's stance is not one of pure bravery, but rather of the bravery that comes from a deeply held trust in his God and the power of his God. His speech to Goliath ranks as one of those great declarations of faith in the face of adversity. It's worthy of any Sophoclean or Shakespearean hero. What did David say? He said this to Goliath. He said, "You come against me with sword and spear and javelin, but I come against you in the name of the Lord of hosts, the God of the ranks of Israel." And it's this thrilling statement that really reshapes the entire story. It changes it from one of combat to one of belief. And it further opens the story to readers in any desperate situation, which really says the lesson in the story that could be had. Anyone can emulate David's stance. You can stand there and do anything. This is the story. This is the lesson of the story. And now, if David's playing the lyre as an image of faith expressed in words, David defeating Goliath is this amazing image of faith expressed in action. So words and action, both. You get these two aspects of David. And taken together, they present a complete picture of the authentic person of God, the man of God. One is emotionally insightful as he is physically courageous. And wouldn't you out there, ladies, wouldn't you want a man that is soft and gentle, tender at heart, at the same time takes a stand, is courageous, doesn't back down, not spineless? And on top of it, as the Bible says, he was good looking. It says of David, he had beautiful eyes and a fair countenance to look on, meaning he was good with the ladies. And so easy on the eyes. So all these things rolled up into one guy. And guys would look at him and go, I want to be him. I'm inspired by his music. And at the same time, I'm inspired by his courageous acts, his actions themselves. And so David stands as his model for anyone who's going to pray and act in God's name. This is where the defining stories of a character's youth are more valuable than the birth narratives. The story of a character's birth imbues that figure with a sense of predestination, a predestination for greatness. I'm talking in biblical senses. It's got this otherworldly quality that adds to the character's glow. At the same time, however, birth stories are distracting for the reader, for there's no possibility of emulating birth stories. You can't go back and be born under a star. You can't emulate that. Things like that. By the time one reads the story, it's too late to emerge from an unremarkable background and define themselves by their own actions. The reader has this visceral reaction. Here is something I can do. I can do this too. I can be there. I can be an as well as this character, and somebody I could aspire to be. Pardon my worsening throat here. I got to keep it calm because I still got a show to do after this with Rocky. So, what you've got here is something that we all could do, we could become, we could aspire to be, is this guy, David. Many of our modern heroes today are defined by their births, but some are not defined by their births, but some are relatively youthful experience, whether legendary or true. Look at, we mentioned this in the first session about David, George Washington, admitting to chopping down the cherry tree. Modern day legend, relatively modern. John F. Kennedy, saving his crew at sea during the Second World War. The character traits we associate with our heroes are frequently sought and found in the defining stories of their youth, the things they did when they were kids, when they were younger. Notably, especially for the purposes, this remains the case even when our heroes conduct themselves later in life in less than heroic ways. Look at JFK. We can go back to, we can focus on his martial maritime experiences and heroics that really kind of cancels out his infidelities later in life. And I know I've had a couple of people write me privately and say, why don't you use your cough button? You know, they make those things with cough buttons. Mine doesn't really have a cough button. I have to go in and click on the mute, but I'd be doing that over and over again. So sorry that I've got a little cough tonight. You're just going to have to live with that. That's part of who I am. I got a cough tonight. And so we'll just put up with it as I do what I'm doing here. So David with the lyre, David facing the giant. These are the very first stories that we read about David in the Bible. And they're also the first stories about him that we learn as children. When we were kids, if you were raised that way, in that faith, you learn those things, not because they're the first in the text, nor because they're about a young man, because they instill the fundamental values of faith. For many, these are in fact the only stories we know about David. That he was the writer of the Psalms and a musician, and that he slew the giant. Many people don't know anything else about David other than that. And why would we need any other stories? Everything anyone would want in a hero, in a king, in an ancestor to the Messiah himself is present in these two aspects of David. The David we meet in the first two chapters of his life is the David of our cultural memory, the David we hold on to in popular imagination. And yet, despite their cultural resonance, despite the values they encapsulate, despite the complete picture of the faithful hero they paint, something is fundamentally askew. And to put it very bluntly, here's the rub, is that both stories can't be true as they're told in the Bible. Because they're told very differently. As if they're not even the same guy. And I want you to notice this. Now, before I move on, just want to see how we're doing over here in the chat room. Try a cough drop. I do, but then it just jags around in my mouth while I'm talking. Clackety, clackety, clackety. So I'm drinking a hot tea. Well, warm tea since I've started. Yeah, it's like John Lennon becoming a Navy SEAL. It's exactly what David was like. Imagine. And so this is the David that we've come to learn who this guy is through these things. But the problem is, and now listen, let me make this point one more time. I'm not attempting to dissemble the story of David. David was definitely a heroic man, definitely a musician. He was definitely the king of Israel. And there was enough of the deeds of his life that made him someone that they wanted to tag the story of the Messiah's birth. The Messiah must come from the loins of David, the seed of David, the offspring. There was something about him that was great. Why not tag this onto the first king, Saul? It's because Saul fell from grace and never returned. Saul died. If you believe, there's a couple of accounts on that too in the Bible. Saul died either a suicide or he died a horrible, miserable death in battle on the slopes of the mountain. And I remember that there's a psalm that David wrote about Saul and his sons and David's good friend, Prince Jonathan, how they all fell on the slopes of the mountain that day. And David wrote a psalm about it. Now remember, David's not with them fighting because he's on the run from King Saul at this time. He's no longer part of the army. He's no longer part of the captain of the king's bodyguard. He's no longer attached to the court of Saul. He's a fugitive. And he hears news of Saul and Jonathan dying on the mountains, and he writes something, how beautiful are the slopes that are where you met your death. And he's writing about his friend Jonathan, how the beauty of Israel has died on the slopes of the mountain. And so he writes about even that. And as this story goes on now, I want to get into why exactly I think these two accounts of David are in conflict with each other. Again, I'm not doing this because I think not doing this to detract from the faith. I'm doing this from outside the faith looking in and saying there are problems with this story, that David isn't who we thought he was. There's an apologetic there. And what that does is it paints the tone of Scripture in a very different light. All right? Now, we've got David's dueling origins here, these beginnings that fight with each other. The narrative in 1 Samuel 16 has David playing the lyre for Saul. On its own terms, it's relatively straightforward. We're introduced to it when when the prophet Samuel goes to anoint one of Jesse's sons. And he anoints him secretly as the king that's going to replace the current king, Saul. And we meet Jesse, we meet David's brothers, each of whom is rejected. Because remember, the prophet Samuel said to Jesse, bring out all your sons. And he brings them all out and uses something like the Urim and the Thurim, these magical stones that would prophesy. They'd lay them the way the light hit them. I don't know what it was. But the prophet rejected each of the older brothers. And then he looks at Jesse and he says, don't you have another son? Is this it? Because God has not accepted any of these. Not because they were bad people, but these are not the guys that God wants. And so Jesse says, oh, I do have one more son. He's the kid. He's out in the fields tending the flocks. And so they send somebody to go fetch David. He's found and he's been brought in from shepherding the flock. And Samuel sets the stones before him. And he says, this is God's chosen. And he anoints David as king. And it says that he's seized from the divine spirit from that moment forward. Now, Saul's spirit, meanwhile, the king, is troubled. His courtiers suggest finding someone who might play the lyre to make Saul feel better. It's not just find a way to make him better. They're specifically asking for somebody who plays the lyre to make the king feel better. And one of the young men immediately thinks of David. I've seen a son of Jesse, the Bethlehemite, who is skilled in music, a man of valor, a warrior, sensible in speech, a handsome man, and the Lord is with him. That's all the things this guy says about David. Saul promptly sends for David, who comes as asked. Saul finds David. Now remember, this guy describes to King Saul, David. He's the son of Jesse, a Bethlehemite, the Bethlehemite. And he's skilled in music and names all these qualities of David. And Saul finds David pleasing and appoints the lad as one of his arms bearers. So he gives him a royal appointment. And he sends word to Jesse that he intends to keep David in the court. And so we're told that whenever Saul felt the evil spirit descend on him, David played his lyre, and the spirit would depart from Saul. Now, we don't know if Saul was really possessed. I don't know what this evil spirit is, or a spirit that was tormenting him, or is it poetic language? But it said that Saul was tormented by an evil spirit, that when David played, the spirit would leave. And so now this is all well and good until we begin to read the story of David and Goliath in 1 Samuel 17. Now, the story I just read you was 1 Samuel 16. Very next chapter, in Samuel 17, suddenly it's as if the previous story had never happened. We're again introduced to the family of David in terms of that make it clear that they're being introduced for the very first time. It says, quote, David was the son of a certain Ephrathite of Bethlehem in Judah, whose name was Jesse. And a certain Ephrathite whose name was Jesse. This is the way that the Bible regularly introduces new characters. Not ones they've already just the chapter earlier told you about. But Jesse is hardly a new character, and why should he be introduced again? We're told he had 8 sons. But again, we already knew this. And furthermore, the names of his 3 sons who had gone to battle were Eliab, the firstborn, Abinadab, and the third was Shammah. And David was the youngest of the 8 sons. And not only did we already know that David was the youngest, we already knew the names and the birth order of his eldest 3 brothers. In fact, we know them relatively well, since it was precisely these 3 men whom Samuel rejected when he anointed David as king earlier. So it would be one thing if the second story gave us the names of the other 4 sons, but it doesn't. There's not a bit of new information about David's family. And what's more, both stories use the eldest brothers in the same way. They kind of paint them as the foils for David. They are characters that make him look better. So they're foils. And in the first story, they're explicitly rejected by Samuel. In the second, they're among those who stand by with the rest of Israel's army while Goliath challenges the Israelites to fight, and they do nothing for 40 days. So then there's this question of where David is when the second story begins. We learned in the previous chapter that Saul had taken him into his service as arms bearer. Since Saul was now out on the battlefield, surely David should be with him, but bearing his arms. But no, where's David at the beginning of this story? When we're reintroduced to chapter later to David's family. He's back home with Jesse. And he goes to battlefield only to bring food to his brothers. He's even supposed to go right back home afterwards at his father's orders, tell him what's going on back in the battle. Again, pardon my coughs. If I could just keep drinking, I'd be okay. So now, admittedly, the second story seems to recognize this confusion about how David spends his time. So we're told that David would go back and forth attending on Saul to shepherd his father's flock in Bethlehem. But even this explanation is scarcely reliable in that, are we to imagine that during peacetime, David was in constant attendance on Saul as the arms bearer, but during a time of war, he was there only occasionally? Furthermore, the narrative, here they are 40 years or 40 days facing the Philistines. And what happens? David goes back home from being Saul's arms bearer to tend the flocks. Seems iffy. So when David goes to the battlefield, it's not even to attend on Saul the king, but only to check on his brothers and bring them food. And it's clear that this is, in fact, David's first time going to battle. Since when he sees Goliath and hears the giant's challenge, he seems to have absolutely no idea that this has been going on for 40 days already. And all of which is to say that the verse stating that David went regularly between Jesse and Saul is not only illogical, but it stands as fairly clear evidence that the discrepancies between the two stories were felt even by the biblical authors back then when they're compiling this book, who made a half-hearted and transparent attempt to reconcile them by stating, oh, and by the way, David kind of went back and forth. But during battle, when he's supposed to be with the king. But from there, the problem only gets worse as we're looking at this expanding gap in the stories. When David goes to Saul and declares his intentions to fight Goliath, Saul's response is, in light of the previous story now, rather surprising. He says, "You're only a boy, and he's been a warrior from his youth." And that's in 2 Samuel 17. And this can hardly be the same David who was introduced to Saul in the previous chapter as a man of valor from the days of his youth, a warrior. Now Saul's calling him a boy. How can you go out and fight him? Because this guy's been a warrior since he was a kid. Then David describes himself entirely in terms of his career as a shepherd. He replies to Saul, "Your servant has been tending his father's sheep." Although surely he would have said that he'd been Saul's arms bearer. Wouldn't it be like, Your Majesty, it's me, David, your arms bearer, the guy who plays music for you, who bears your sword and your armor? And the disconnect between these two stories here becomes really head-to-head. At the end of 1 Samuel, it says, when Saul saw David going out to confront the Philistine, he said to Abner, his general, the army commander, Whose son is that boy, Abner? Now, this question is by any reckoning inconceivable. Inconceivable, because Saul took David into his service in the previous chapter. David was especially pleasing to Saul. Saul appointed him his personal arms bearer. David regularly played the lyre to soothe Saul's spirit. Saul even communicated directly with Jesse, David's father. How could he now not know who David is? Only when we reach this unfathomable question in the text do we realize that nowhere in the second story has Saul addressed David by name, nor has David offered it. It seems that to Saul, David is just a kid who has volunteered to fight. And only when he is successful does it occur to the king to discover who the lad might be, but he should have known and known it well already. So you got these chapter 1 and 2 of the stories of David don't mesh. They're like two totally different origin stories of David and his relationship to the king. Now, the conclusion of the Goliath story is to be found in the first two verses, or the first verses of the next chapter, 1 Samuel 18. And we read this. It says, Saul took him, David, into his service that day and would not allow him to return to his father's house. And with this, the parallel nature of the two stories is fully revealed. Both begin with no foreknowledge of who David is, such that we have to be introduced to him and to his family and his father, his three eldest brothers, his four unnamed brothers. Both describe how David comes to Saul's attention through his skills at playing the lyre and through his bravery on the battlefield. Both have Saul pleased with David because he soothes Saul's spirit and because he is victorious against Goliath. And both conclude with the explicit notice that Saul took David into his permanent service, thereby severing David from his home in Bethlehem. Now, in short, what we've got here in these two chapters are two stories of David that rise, David's rise to prominence in Saul's court, and the two stories that are identical in function and parallel in structure, but thoroughly incompatible as sequential episodes. Get what I mean by that? They didn't happen one after the other or one before the other. They're two equal stories that tell equal outcomes in totally different stories. And so the function and the parallel and structure are completely different. In a historical narrative, this is especially obvious, that the narrative is obviously not historical, at least one of them. And the parallel and the independent existence of the two accounts is remarkably proved by the evidence of the Greek translation of the Bible, the Hebrew Bible, during the 4th century BCE, the Septuagint, which we've talked about. And this was when if you remember from other lessons we've done, this was when the 72 rabbis got permission from Ptolemy II, the Greek pharaoh of Egypt, in the 400s, after the Babylonian captivity of Israel. And the children of Israel are sent back home. They go, these 72 rabbis, to reconstruct the Hebrew scriptures and the history of the Hebrew people, of the Israelite people. And so this is what they did at the Library of Alexandria. And so that document they created was the Septuagint, which is basically, for all practical purposes, the Old Testament you look at today. If I were to open up this old Bible I have and look at the Old Testament, that's basically the Septuagint in English form in this Bible. So these two chapters shows that the Hebrew version, the Greek text of 1 Samuel, huge chunks of this Goliath story we know from the Hebrew Bible are missing. And those chunks are precisely the ones that contain almost all of the contradictions within 1 Samuel 16. So the parallel and independent existence of the two accounts is evidence of the Greek translation of the Hebrew Bible in the Septuagint. And the Hebrew version preserves this fully separate account of David's defeat of Goliath, one that likely circulated independently, hence its reintroduction of the main characters, its distinctive description of David, its ignorance of David's established relationship with Saul, and these structural parallels within 1 Samuel 16. And it's only at a much later point was this independent story of David's victory over Goliath combined with the alternative story found in the Septuagint, thereby creating the literary mess that is the canonical text of 1 Samuel 16 through 17. We therefore have these two independent and truly irreconcilable stories about how David emerged from obscurity to become a presence in the royal court of Saul. And so really what you had with the Septuagint was these two stories. They probably argued over them, and they put them both in. Which one was true? Now, it's easy enough to see why both would be valuable to the biblical authors. As we've already seen, both stories represent David in this very flattering light. He was a young man. He was faithful to both his king and to his God. But both cannot be historically true, for they contradict each other at almost every single turn of story. And these contradictions illustrate one of the main difficulties with reading the Bible as history. The Bible, now, mind you, I do have to tell you here, I have said over and over again that the Bible contains efficacious history. I didn't say you could read it word for word as history, because it's filled with a faith story. It's filled with apologetics. This is why you have to dig out, root out the historical efficacy in the Old Testament scriptures. It's there. If you can extricate it from the stories of faith and the stories that are really apologetics written about the characters or about the events. And that's the main difficulty here. The Bible is nothing if not a theological work. But they cannot provide us with firm grounds for complete historical reconstruction. You're going to find that even in the life of Moses, when we went through and we read that book, you cannot reconstruct act for act the deeds of Moses on a historical basis. Even with the plagues of Egypt and things like that, no way to accurately reconstruct that history, if it even happened the way we think it did, or the way the Bible tells us it did. In a situation like this, presented by these two chapters, we're forced to make a decision as to which tradition seems more likely to have any historical value. And it's a decision that we can make only on the basis of a close analysis of each tradition independently. You got to look at them as two independent stories. And unfortunately, when we look at these two famous biblical traditions about David as the musically gifted author of the Psalms and as the uniquely courageous slayer of Goliath, we find that not only can we both not be historical true, but in fact, neither is historically true. And I think that's the conclusion that we have to be left with about these origin stories of David. Sad to say. And now it's 10:14. I want to get into this a little bit more. We're going to talk about the author of the Psalms, David, and why he's considered to be the author of Psalms. I want to talk about, I'm just fast forwarding in my own notes here. Is he really the slayer of Goliath? This is something we're going to hit tomorrow night. I could get into it tonight, but it would take us long beyond the time I'm supposed to be ready for Rocky's show. So we're going to get into that more tomorrow. These Psalms of David, did he actually write them? What was written? And is he actually the slayer of Goliath? How could such a rich, historic, traditional, faith-based story end up being something we have to ask the question, did it ever really happen the way it says it happened? So I'm going to look into that a little bit tomorrow. Yeah, sorry, Delaney, about my cough hack snort cough. That's just for tonight. You can hear in my voice getting a little worse. So I think I got to rest up my voice before I go on with Rocky. And yes, we adapt, we overcome. James, thank you very much. And Jeannie says, just listening, trying to relax while the kitchen sink gives you problems. I hope you get that fixed. So what you missed tonight, you can certainly go back and listen. I know we had a little, once again, some scheduling conflict with Jeff's show. And I believe the Professor Bauer was on with Jeff tonight. And if I have my facts straight, I might be wrong about that. It just might be Jeff talking. So anyway, there you go. Robert Stanley. All right. So there you go. Let's go back a little bit through here and see if anybody threw up anything that I need to take a look at. Let's see. Goliath was a Nephilim, James asked, and yes. He and his three older brothers, or I don't know if they were older, his three brothers, were called descendants of Anak, or descendants of the Nephilim. Yeah, my wife stepped in here, everybody. TT said, hey. My poor pipes, thank you, Michelle. But there they are. There it is. And Patriots Corner, Lewis, you're in here. Thanks for being here. Yeah, John Lennon, like it'd be like John Lennon becoming a Navy SEAL. Pretty much what David was like, according to these stories. Jeannie, good to see you here. I'm glad you're here. And Delaney, it's Delaney's Delight Jones. Good to have you here. And I know who you are. Just wanted to say it that way. So I've seen you before, Jeff's channel and Rocky's channel. So Yana Scribe, James says, probably made it up. We don't know this. Here's the problem with these two stories. Did somebody make up a story, or was a different version of the story told? We know how some of these things go. You hear a story about somebody when they were young, somebody famous. Then somebody else will come along, oh, no. He didn't grow up in Boston. He grew up in Baltimore. Didn't you know this story about blah, blah, blah? And we'll hear that kind of stuff all the time. And so I think what you see here is two different stories that were told. One might have been true. One might have been an apologetic. Neither might be true. We do know that the guy existed. I don't think there's any reason to believe he didn't. But which one of those stories are true? Maybe it's a merging of both of them. That was a truth. So there we go. And we've got people coming in. Jeff's show must have ended or something, because we got a few more people coming in. We're just getting ready to wrap it up here. So, yeah, Chinese Whispers, says Suze. And thank you, Delaney, for loving the shows. I appreciate that. And Lewis, whatever you said, the message retracted, was probably naughty. And that's why you retracted it. So, love you too, Becky, or Suze. That's Becky, Semper Fi, right back at you. So I'm going to go gargle. I'm going to go splash some water on my face. I may or may not change my shirt. Get my throat a little calmed down. We do have, Rocky and I have a guest on tonight. Good friend of mine, Pierre Arnold. And we're going to be talking about an interesting take on a very old, worn-out topic. Now, don't let the topic keep you from tuning us in. Abortion. Hate talking about the topic. But the question is going to be asked, what do you really believe about where you stand on abortion? Because the whole idea of being pro-life or pro-choice, that's the emotional side of things. What's at the core? Is there a science at the core? Is there something you can depend on that's deeper? So Pierre offers a very good insight onto this, and it's going to perk your your mind up a little bit. So tune in tonight. And unless Pierre dies before we get there, it's going to be an interesting show tonight. I don't think he will die. And I'll see you over there in the chat room. So I want to thank you for being here. I'll be back tomorrow night. Hopefully voice in a little better stead tomorrow night. And we'll pick up this story of David where we left off. Talking about, let's examine the Psalms. Let's examine the story of David and Goliath. And I hate to tell you this. Not to be here's a spoiler alert. I think some of the things that we think and hold dear about some of these stories, they get a little crumbled. You look into them and you come out a better person because you know more. And you're able to make better decisions. But sometimes you come out and you go, wow, that really dashed my picture of what I thought really was. You might come out that way, but be prepared for that. And thank you, Michelle. Try to be. There you go. All right, folks. Hearts, loves, stars. Vulcan, live long and prosper. Symbols to you all. Thanks for being here. I'll be back tomorrow night, 9 p.m. Central Standard Time, 10 o'clock Eastern. Go to my website, scottallenroberts.com. Go to my website with Rocky, streamingtalkradio.com. All the links are over there for everything. By the way, see, I'm wearing it. Son of a Patriot. That's one of my shirts. Son of a Patriot. So you can get your Son of a Patriot gear, the Meatball Army gear, and all other kinds of patriotic cool stuff over at my Etsy's page. And the link is over on streamingtalkradio.com. Thanks for being here. Pacific time tomorrow. Pacific time, if we're 9 o'clock here, it's 7 p.m. Pacific time. So thanks for being here. See you then. Catch you later. Love you all. I appreciate your being here. Means a lot to me. Have a good night. See you on Rocky's show in about 40 minutes. Good night.